is offered. Okay, got it. This is offered by the UAB Comprehensive Neuroscience Center, or CNC. So, okay, there we go. So the CNC is a network of neuroscience faculty at UAB, clinicians, staff, students, and trainee. Because all the neuroscientists are located in different schools, in different departments, it was really important to have a platform that allows for a way that the neuroscientists can meet and apply neuroscience research at UAB. So the CNC Neuroscience Cafe is a monthly forum that brings neuroscientists, usually UAB neuroscientists, basic neuroscientists and clinicians together to discuss their current research and knowledge on various topics that has to do with the brain. Tonight, we're going to extend our neuroscientists to include those from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. So this is very exciting. So our mission is to accelerate discovery by promoting excellence in basic, translational, and clinical neuroscience research, education, and clinical care through integrating the UAB-wide neuroscience community. And our vision is a world where the mysteries of the nervous system are solved. This is the CNC leadership as of January 2021. I'm the director of the CNC. My name is Adrienne Latti. I'm a professor and I'm the chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurobiology at UAB. The co-director is Lucas Pozomiller, who is a professor in the Department of Neurobiology, and associate director is Lauren Sinsich, who is an associate professor in the Department of Optometry and Vision Science. So we are really excited today to have Dr. Charlene Newman as a speaker. Dr. Newman is a cognitive neuroscientist. She's the executive director of the Alabama Lab Research Institute at the University of Alabama. She's professor in the Department of Psychology. And also, she's an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Science at Indiana University, where she was previously. Her research specialized in understanding brain function using neuroimaging methods such as fMRI. She was one of the first to apply this neuroimaging technique to study language processing in the human brain, which helped identify which region of the brain are involved in different linguistic functions. She has also worked on using neuroimaging to understand other aspects of brain function, such as executive function, mathematical and spatial processing, substance addiction, and psychopathology. So her title is The Relationship Between Spatial Processing and Math, a Block Party. Intriguing. So before I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Newman, I'm going to let you know we have upcoming cafe. So July 15, Dr. Houston, who is going to speak about conclusion, post-conclusion syndrome, and visual disturbances. August 19, Dr. Uswate and Loken, brain fog after COVID. September 16, Dr. Zaflarski, medicine and cannabis. October 21, Dr. Amara and Allendorfer, exercise and neuro disorders. And finally, again, people from UA, November 18, Dr. Pelliccioni and Silo. Can brain science help us understand how we should learn math? So don't forget that we like for you to ask questions So once Dr. Charlene is done after with her presentation, the recording of this presentation can be found on our website. So that's uab.edu/medicine/CNC. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor. I'm going to stop sharing and give the floor to Dr. Newman.
Okay, thank you for having me. That took a few clicks to get here. So I think it's important probably for me to just talk a little bit about myself before I get started. So I'm actually a graduate of UAB. I got my PhD at UAB in biomedical engineering. So while I'm not at UAB now, I am connected. So I do have that history with UAB. Also, I mean, it also looks, and I guess I would say I'm an unusual neuroscientist. I'm an unusual cognitive neuroscientist at that, given that my education is in engineering. I worked with Don Tweed as a graduate student in MRI and just became more fascinated with the brain. And so I did a postdoc in psychology at Carnegie Mellon. The talk that I'm going to give is probably more cognitive than neuroscience, but I don't really separate the two because cognition is all about how we think, and a lot of how we think is related to the brain. So I don't necessarily separate them that much. So today, even though the title of my talk is The Relationship Between Spatial Processing and Math, I'm really I've changed it. Once I started pulling it together, it kind of shifted. And what I really want to talk about is this relationship between visual spatial processing and STEM. So beyond just math, but science, technology, engineering, and math. So STEM more broadly defined. Just to orient you on what I'll talk about. So I'm first going to give you some definitions so that we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk about this relationship between STEM achievement or attainment and visual spatial processing. Then give some examples and talk about drawing as well as block play and their relationship to STEM and using arithmetic as the example. So I'm going to get to math, but it's going to be a minute before I get to math. And then talk about some potential implications of the work. So that's what we'll do. I also don't necessarily, just to warn you, I don't necessarily like to hear the sound of my voice. So I'm completely okay with people just sort of jumping in and asking a question. I know that's hard to do with Zoom, much easier to do if we were in person, but I'm okay with that. I'd rather have us have a conversation than me just sort of talk at you. So if we can find a way to do that with Zoom, then I'm okay with trying to make that happen. Okay. So to jump in, what is spatial processing? So spatial processing is really when you create a representation of the world in your mind that you, not a nonverbal representation, that you're able to transform, manipulate. So just imagining like a pulley system and thinking about which direction the wheels go and how the rope sort of moves in the pulley system. So that's an example of us using spatial processing. Navigation is another sort of spatial processing kind of task. So thinking about the layout of a room or a building and how you're going to get to from one place to another within the room, right? So it's just representing the world in mind in a visual sort of form, visual spatial form that allows you to manipulate it and transform it in your mind, right? So that's the whole idea of spatial processing. The figure here is just an example of a task that's used to assess spatial processing ability, and it's a mental rotation task. where you're asked to decide whether the two objects are the same or different. And typically one object is rotated in some way by some degree of angular rotation. And you're, again, just asked to decide whether they're the same or different, right? Now, visual perception. So I said I was going to talk about visual spatial processing. So the visual perception is what you sort of think that it is, right? So it's the ability to interpret a visual image. So one example of a task used to assess some of that are these sort of noisy visual images, and your task is to determine what's in the image, right? So I don't know if you can sort of pull out what's in this sort of noisy image, but there's a bear here, and there's a tree. And so I think one of the things to point out is that visual ability and spatial ability are separate things, right? So you can be really good at spatial processing, where you can generate this representation of an object and manipulate it in your mind. But that object doesn't necessarily have lots of details and color, and it's not very vivid, right? So it's a representation, but it's like a poor representation, right? So you can be really good at the spatial part and not so good at the visual, or you can be really good like visual imager, where you can close your eyes and imagine a beach, and you can see the colors of the sky, and you can imagine what the birds look like, and you can create a really detailed visual image, but you may be crappy at spatial, at manipulating things in it. So visual is different than spatial. They're separate abilities, and you can be good at one and not so good at the other. There are some people who are good at both, and then there's some people who are really crappy at both, right? And so I'll take me as an example. I'm a good spatial imager. I'm not so sort of good at creating these sort of really vivid images, right? That's not my thing. But spatial, I'm pretty decent at. I can create an okay sort of visual image. And if you sort of think about your own ability, you'll see where you kind of sort of sit in that space. Okay, so now there's a lot of research that shows a relationship between visual spatial processing ability, spatial in particular, and STEM achievement, right? And it appears as though there's a strong relationship between the two, where maybe STEM achievement is somewhat dependent on your ability to reason with visual spatial information, right? And so when thinking about math, there's a lot of spatial processing connected to math. Number itself has been linked to spatial processing. But when we're thinking about like equations and solving algebraic equations, there's a lot of movement that we talk about when we're talking about that. We sort of move numbers from one place to another. We group things spatially when we're doing this type of math. And so there is a sort of relationship between the two, and they do seem to be dependent. And there are studies that have shown that a strong correlation between the two. But also when you think about it, I had to put like a spinning atom because I'm an MR person, right? And so even thinking about atomic spins and the way these atoms sort of spin, and then you can manipulate them with a magnetic field and tipping them out and watching them precess. So that's a lot of sort of spatial processing that you do to think about how these spins are manipulated and what happens when you do these different sort of perturbations of these spins is really spatial. It's a lot of that thinking is spatial, right? We don't keep it in verbal form. We imagine what's happening and what it looks like and what's going on. The same with chemical bonds, right? So these interactions between these different chemicals, or putting things together, it's all visual spatial information, right? So STEM is filled with that. And this is just talking about visual spatial information in this way, right? But there, as we'll see in a minute, we use it in other ways too in STEM. Okay. So here's just an example study that a graduate student I worked with at Indiana did. He was an anatomy student and interested in this relationship between visual spatial processing and achievement, or sort of how well students did in anatomy class. And so what he did was he had the participants within the first couple of weeks of the semester, perform this mental rotation task and this sort of object detection task. And then at the end of the semester, looked at the correlation between performance on these cognitive tests, these visual-spatial tests, and course performance on both the course grade and the lab grade. And he did find this correlation between visual perception and class performance, and a kind of marginal kind of relationship between mental rotation, right? And this makes sense when you think about anatomy, because in the lab you're looking at, let's say, the hippocampus and having to detect the hippocampus out of the rest of the brain, right? And so some structures are easier or harder to sort of pull out of that background. And really, it's not background. And so being able to pull it out of the noise in some way, it's important to have really good visual spatial processing ability to be able to do that.
Can I ask so how does that correlate with visual perception with IQ?
So I will say the spatial ability definitely does. And so how should I? So I have issues with how IQ is defined, right? So when you look at the tests that assess IQ, a lot of those tests are very spatial processing kinds of tasks. The non-verbal are spatial. And so it correlates. Yeah. So I'm still trying to push him to publish some of this work, but he did the study, he presented it at a conference. And now it's like, once they graduate, it becomes a little difficult to make them publish, but that's where we are with this study. So I wanted to talk about drawing here. And so I got interested in drawing after having some conversations with a colleague at Indiana who was in architecture. And interestingly, her name was Marlene. So, but we weren't related, but she was again, an architecture faculty member, and she would complain all the time about how her students now have really bad sort of spatial processing ability. She's like, they don't draw at all anymore. They do everything on CAD. They don't use pencil and paper and sketch and draw. And she was like convinced that that was why they had such problem with depth processing. And it was just really hard to get them to think about stairs going down and what that looked like. But she was just convinced that it was drawing, that their lack of drawing, that was why they were struggling so much. And so we started. And the other thing is if you have an architect who's a friend, if you walk around with them, they see things that I don't see. Like their visual perception is just different than my visual perception. And I mean, this is like visual artists in general, right? And so the way they see depth, the way they see shadow, the way they it's just different. So I'm like, we went on a walk around one of the towns in close to Bloomington, Indiana, and he's like, this guy's pointing out all these things, and I'm like, I don't see anything. I just don't see it. But so we were interested, and we sort of put together the study to take a look at it, but I left Indiana. We did write a grant, it didn't get funded, so the study kind of went nowhere, but I'm still fascinated by this relationship between how drawing changes visual perception in particular, and how that may have an impact on STEM attainment. I'll also say there's a whole other sort of line of research around the relationship between drawing and STEM that's related to how sketching out your understanding of a science or mathematical concept improves how you understand that concept, right? So there are these ideas that sometimes we don't have the language to describe something, and once we start to draw it, we begin to like understand how things work better. It's a way of like communicating that's quite different than language. And there are studies that have shown that in class, if you have students sketch out the concept, that they understand the concept better than if they just describe it in words. And this is like from a chemistry class. So there's some really kind of interesting relationships between drawing and sketching and STEM. So while we weren't able to do the study that we wanted to do, but we were just still kind of tossing around ideas because I was at the time an associate vice provost in undergraduate education. I had access to all the institutional data. So we went into the data to see if there were students who had taken a drawing course right before they took a STEM course, and we sort of picked chemistry, we picked organic chemistry. And we found 45 of those students who took drawing to fulfill a gen ed requirement before they took organic chemistry. And we do see like, somewhat of a relationship between their performance in the drawing course and their performance in organic chemistry. Now, of course, there are all kinds of caveats here because good students may perform well in every class. And so it could be something else going on here. But it gave us a little hope that there could be some interesting sort of results that could come out of having STEM students take drawing. And we had conversations about creating a drawing for STEM majors, right? Where the focus really is on visual perception and rotation and looking at objects from different sort of perspectives kind of thing. But again, we weren't able to sort of pull that together, but it was something that we were thinking about a lot. Okay. So I've also done some work now over the past few years looking at block play as a way of improving or sort of training visual spatial ability. And so kids learn a lot through play. And there are different types of spatial play, but there are also, of course, all kinds of play, right? So there's Legos, and we've seen all the commercials now talking about girls playing with Legos and building and Legos and STEM. So you've seen those commercials and the importance of doing that kind of thing. I think many of us probably had those kind of blocks growing up as kids and playing and building things. And puzzles is also a form of spatial play as well. But we did some studies using this game, Blocks Rock, which is a structured block building game. And by structured block building, what I mean is you have to create a structure. Basically, you're copying a structure. So there's a configuration on a card, and you have to build what's on the card. And it's a competitive game, which we thought was important because we wanted kids to stay interested because we were doing the study with young kids. And if you make it competitive, then they sort of keep interest in the game long enough to play it long enough. So this is the game that we used in a series of studies. The other type of block play is more like free block play, where you're just building things out of imagination, right? So there are some Legos where you actually build something, you're copying, and then there are other sort of types of Legos where you're just doing free block play. These kind of blocks are more free block play. Right. So our first study, what we wanted to do was to see whether or not this block play, these block building games actually improved in some way spatial processing. So we did this in 8-year-olds. We had a group of 8-year-olds, and they did 5 sessions of playing either the structured block building game, the Blocks Rock game, or they played Scrabble. And we didn't really think this through carefully because Scrabble also has a spatial component, right? Because you're building words up and down and across. And because the task that we used to assess spatial processing was a mental rotation task, but it was mental rotation of letters. So in some ways, the Scrabble had an advantage over Bloxrock because they were looking at letters while they were playing and looking at letters in different kind of orientations. Again, we didn't think this through completely, but this is the study that we did. So again, we had block play and Scrabble. They did 5 sessions of either Scrabble or the structured block building game. And they performed this mental rotation task without, again, our goal was just to determine whether or not we could train and improve spatial processing in 8-year-olds. And so we did see in the block play group improvements in performance in the mental rotation task. We also had another task that I'm not showing here, which is a spatial problem solving game. We also saw improvements there in the block play group. We do see improvements in the Scrabble group as well. The improvements weren't statistically significant, but our sample size is also small, so I don't want to make a big deal out of that. So we do see improvements in both in spatial processing in both the block play and the Scrabble group. It was just significant in the block play group, but not in the Scrabble group. Now, the interesting thing was the brain imaging data. And so what we found there was that the Scrabble group didn't really show any brain activation differences between before and after training. But the block play group did. And they showed differences in like the parahippocampal region and cerebellum, which we attributed to like spatial working memory and spatial processing, as well as like motor processing, with this idea that the block play group actually thought about rotating the letters more holistically and thought about like the motion involved in that rotation. And so, yeah, so that paper was published in 2016. But what we also tried to do in this study, but the sample size was too small and there were some other issues, was to look at the relationship between this block play and math processing and arithmetic processing. We weren't able to really pull that off in this study. So we did another study that allowed us to look at arithmetic processing. And here we looked at addition and subtraction, but we changed the Scrabble, the Scrabble game, and we compared the structured block play, again, where they're doing this copying the design, to free block play, where they're just building structures out of their imagination. And we increased the sample size a bit, still 8-year-olds. And what we saw here was really interesting because we saw differences between addition and subtraction in terms of the impact of block play, the type of block play. So what we found is for addition, only the block play group showed an improvement in performance. Subtraction, both groups showed improvements, significant improvements in performance. Now I should sort of just note that the differences in performance between pre and post, you expect to see some differences because they've already seen the task before, and so there should be some practice effects. And so you do see some differences, but they're not significant for the free block play for addition, but significant for the structured block play for addition. And again, both showed effects for subtraction. We also saw differences in the changes in brain activation. So for the free block play group, they actually showed decreases in activation from pre to post. And they show these decreases in activation in regions that have been linked to arithmetic processing and some spatial processing. But those activation differences were quite different for the structured block play group, right? So one, they showed increases in activation from pre to post, not decreases in activation. And they did for both addition and subtraction. They showed increases in activation, right? And so what we think, and we don't really know exactly what's going on. Of course, we have hypotheses, but I don't want to sort of bore you with like what we're imagining is going on so much. But other than the fact that they're using different strategies, right? And so how they're tackling subtraction is likely different between these two groups based on the training that they received in terms of which type of block play that they were engaged in. And so then the last study that I wanted to talk about is one with preschool students. And so what I think I would like to see is working with younger kids. So 8-year-olds, they've had lots of experience doing with different types of play, including block play. They also already have a lot of experience with arithmetic processing. And so I think being able to influence kids younger and change, to see how we can potentially change their spatial processing ability would be important. And so first we wanted to just see whether or not these young kids, these 4-year-olds, were actually able to play the structured block building game, because it is a complex game. And we did find a lot of variance first. But we did find that they were able to play. And so these are just some comments from the research assistants who were helping them play. And so you had one of the students who wanted a lot of help. And what you see is there's a lot of like spatial language that's used when you're interacting with young kids and this type of play where you're talking about where you use terms like on top of and next to, and there's a lot of like color language as well. But it's always, about sort of the spatial relationships. So you're pointing out these spatial relationships. You're helping them sort of ground that spatial processing in a lot of ways. And then you had some kids who, they were good. They knew what they were doing. And they just picked out the hard cards and they could do the hard. They didn't want to do the easy ones because they were too easy, and they just went straight for the hard ones, right? So which I think is interesting to think about when you're talking about kids as young as 4, and you have this huge variance in their exposure to blocks. And I'm going to come back to some potential sort of reasons for that. So again, what we did, we went into these preschools, and we did go into Head Start. So we wanted to control for some of the environmental sort of differences, which we decided we would use maternal education as a proxy for what that home environment may be like. And so we did find and we had two classes. We had a class that we went in and they played the Blocks Rock game, and we sort of helped them play the Blocks Rock game, and we did that once a week for 8 weeks. And then a control class where we did go into the class, but we didn't play a game, just so that they can be familiar with us. And then we did a pre and post test where we used the iStar test, which is an Indiana Department of Education sort of assessment of preschoolers and to determine sort of kindergarten readiness. So again, we did see that the block play group showed some training effects for the computation component of the iStar when you control for maternal education, right? And really what we found when you look at that computational component is that the block play group improved in their skill to make sets of objects larger or smaller. So it was a particular part of the computation component that we saw improvements in. This was also a small sample, but it gave us hope that we could potentially do some research and some studies looking at and training spatial processing in 4-year-olds that may have significant implications for their educational attainment, particularly in math and science later. So that was kind of exciting. So I think maybe just to summarize quickly in terms of the block play stuff, I think one of the things that we found is that that spatial ability can be trained through play. and that training potentially has implications for arithmetic processing. And so I think that's really important. I think the other thing that we found is the type of play matters. So structured block building had different effects than free play with blocks. So the type, and likely what's happening is that you're just training different types of spatial processing. And so then it becomes like, how is that impacting, in our sort of case, arithmetic processing? I do want to sort of talk about gender effects like briefly. And so in the spatial processing world and in the STEM world, you know, there's a lot of conversation about gender differences. The spatial processing literature is sort of filled with studies that show that suggest that females have poor spatial processing ability than males. I just like to be, I guess, maybe disagreeable, and I don't sort of follow in that tradition. I don't think that that's the case. And one example that I like to give a lot is that if you want to sort of take these sort of gender sort of roles into account, if you've ever tried to, let's say, make a dress from a pattern, patterns are incredibly spatially hard to follow, right? I mean, if you think about what like a sleeve looks like and have to imagine sort of rolling that thing up and sewing this way and sewing that way, I mean, patterns are hard. Patterns for like crocheting and knitting, those things are very spatially sort of complex. So it's not that females are bad at spatial processing. So then the question becomes like, then why do you see these differences in these gender differences in tests? And part of that, I would argue, is that the tests are filled with, are basically tests that have you look at these kinds of things and rotate them. And these look like Legos. They look like the kinds of blocks that what we tend to give boys more than we give girls. So how girls play and what we give girls to play with is quite different than what we give boys to play with, which impacts what they're learning and how their brain is forming and developing, that will have implications later. I mean, we will see the effect of that play later. So you give a girl a doll to play with and you give a boy some blocks to play with, and then you wonder why they're different later. I mean, a lot of that I think is culture. Now, we can argue about whether it's something else, but I argue that it's not about, as a girl who's good at spatial processing and math, I argue it's not about gender. And I also want to sort of maybe end with talking a little bit about drawing for STEM and advocating maybe a bit for having our STEM students take a drawing class and sort of broadening sort of the visual perception abilities, I think would be important to consider doing. And so finally, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators, Farad, who's now at UA, Theo, who did the anatomy study, and Marlene, who sort of got me super interested in the impact of drawing on visual spatial processing. And then a lot of the students who've been in my lab, including a whole gang of undergrads who did this work. And I always have to acknowledge my family, my parents and my daughter. So questions?
Yeah, we can open to a question. Do you want to stop sharing?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So we can see each other. So the question. You know, I never understood why some people love organic chemistry and some people hate organic chemistry. but I start to understand that. And I was one person who loved organic chemistry, but just because it was fun to move around things, right? And so I never kind of like realized that.
Yeah. It's one of those things where, sometimes I have conversations with students because I think this, going off on a tangent, but it's one of the things that annoy me about how we teach sometimes. And like in high school, they do this flashcard method of studying and learning, but they're not learning. They're not thinking, they're memorizing stuff. And then when they get to organic, it doesn't work as well anymore. Or they get to, some of the other courses that they actually have to think about how things work and how things, can be manipulated, and that they haven't been trained to do that as much, I think, is a problem.
But I think you are right. The toys that little girl and little boy have totally different, and it's certainly prepared to different skills.
Yep.
Okay. Questions? Nobody has questions? Come on. No? This one. Okay, we have in the chat, there's some, we have Robert Collar who said, drawing on the right side of the brains. Comment.
Yeah, this right brain, left brain conversation, I think is an interesting one. I think the more creative aspect of drawing is, so first I would say drawing is a bilateral brain process. And I would probably say that the more creative aspects of that may be more sort of right brain, the more sort of making connections between, like things may be, more right brain. But in terms of like impacting visual perception, you really understand depth a lot better if you have to draw it. Right? So like, I think we've all probably tried to draw like a 3D cube before, right? And so you get a different understanding of what that is when you try to actually draw it. And watching like kids try to figure that out is just fascinating to me. So there's, when I'm talking about drawing, I'm talking about really like how that impacts like your perception, like how you, and not just perception, but how you figure out like how to move things in your mind, because you have to take things from the visual in some way from the real and bring it into your brain and then bring it back out through your hands. And there's a lot of like transformations that have to happen. And if you're able to make all those transformations, then you really understand what's going on in a way that you maybe don't if you don't have to make all those transformations. So when I'm talking about the way I'm talking about it is that, not the more sort of creative, artistic kind of drawing.
So, something I was thinking of, this is completely anecdotal and subjective and probably means nothing, but way, way, way back when, before most people here were born, I was in high school and my parents were just trying to find things to stick me over the summer. And I ended up in a high school, and amongst other things, I ended up taking a class in drafting. And this was old school drafting. Nobody drafts like this anymore. This was like, paper and pencil, rulers, blueprints. I made real blueprints that were actually blue. It's a classic art that is just not done today. I swear I learned a better appreciation for precision, and because you had to worry about, when you're drawing, you had to worry about the angle of the pencil versus the ruler. You're making an isometric drawing, you had to kind of plan it out to make sure it actually fit on the silly page. I swear I looked at things differently after that and had better skills at certain things, but everyone else laughs at me. And nobody ever does it. Everyone, it's all automatic. It all snaps together and looks beautiful.
Yeah.
But I swear it changed something in how I approach things.
No, and I would agree. And Marlene would definitely sort of be jumping up and down, like going, yes, this is why I want my architecture students to draw and not sort of use CAD. I want them to draw.
I mean, CAD's great. I do CAD, but you point and click, everything works, everything lines up. When you're actually dealing with the physical reality of a ruler, and a pen, and you have to worry about the fact that it has a finite width, it forces you to think a level or two ahead. And it doesn't auto-center. You actually have to think about where it's going to be. I'm not saying
the thinking is spatial, right? The thinking is really, some of that thinking is spatial. Marlene also argues that there's something about the using a physical pencil and the pressure and the haptic part of that. She thinks that there's
I still take notes on things. I just like doodling, but I think it's just because it's so much more challenging. It really pushes you the way that going to grid snaps on a CAD program does not. Well, that's just me. I'm old school. No one does that, and nobody will do that. But maybe if there was something less obviously prehistoric one could do to challenge people at the same level.
Yeah. I see some more questions.
We have several comments and questions on the chat. What are corresponding studies in rodent?
That I do not know. Okay, there must be some. I mean, they definitely are very good at spatial processing, especially navigation. So, but I think it would be interesting to see, but I don't know.
We have a comment from someone who is not a scientist. This may be a pertinent question, not a pertinent question. Has there been any studies or links pertaining to block play, like following the instruction for putting together Lego project and children with dyslexia? What about dyslexia and art?
That's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that. So dyslexia is a much more complex, and I would say syndrome than most people, I think, understand. There are definitely some interesting spatial things with dyslexia that could be interesting, right? So it's common for dyslexics to mix up left and right, and not be able to tell the left from right kind of thing. I don't know how much work has been done really sort of focused on looking at spatial processing in dyslexics. I don't know. Now I'm curious. I need to go look. I don't know.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And then we have, seems like there is a huge gap between understanding spatial relationship and recognizing how they would change from another's perspective, for example, and being able to convey or draw that perspective change.
Yeah. I think I understand the question, but I may not completely understand the comment.
Is there a difference in how those are processed in the brain?
Being able to, your perspective versus someone else's perspective? Yes. There are some, and I'm blanking on some of these studies, but they're definitely on the details of these studies, but there are studies that show differences in how we process our perspective versus someone else's perspective. I don't quite get the drawing part, so I don't know if Steve wants to elaborate a bit.
She said,
being versus
hey, I'm sorry, I just realized, gee, I could ask it out loud instead of trying to type it in. Sorry about that. What I was curious about is the difference between our ability to understand something versus being able to convey it. So the input or getting it into your brain versus the output of getting it out. How the difference in, for example, spatial perspective goes. You may easily be able to understand how something looks from another person's perspective. But if you were trying to convey that, let's say if you were drawing it, it's a totally different thing. And so what's the as far as the processing it in the brain, how are we both input and output of spatial perception?
Yeah, that's
Still
hard.
a terrible question. I don't know if it helped or not, but that's where I was trying to go.
Yeah, it's hard because you know what you output is based on how well you've represented it, right? And so it's hard to know if you just had a crappy representation because you didn't really get it. And so you're going to output exactly what you have represented, or you've created a really nice representation, but somehow you're not able to get that out. That it's hard to tell which one of those that is. And I mean, and thinking about language, I mean, that there's definitely these ideas, because most of my work has been in the language space. There's definitely these sort of ideas of there being like this input representation and then an output representation.
Right. And I distinctly remember when I was a kid, my dad was reading the newspaper, and I was just sitting there, and he was reading. He wasn't saying anything, and I said, "Well, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm reading the paper." And I said, "But you're not saying anything." And he said, "Well, I'm reading it. I'm just not saying it out loud as I read it." And that was like an epiphany. Gee, you can actually read something but not have to say it. So where I got from that is it's still your brain is still understanding what you're reading. And if you're going to try to convey that to somebody else and explain what you just read, for example, the processes are linked based on your understanding of what you just read. So that part is the same. However, the input of it, if you will, and the encoding of it in your brain is different than how you are trying to get it out. And that junction is where I think a lot of the miscommunications happen. Obviously, I mean, like,
Yeah, and language for sure. But in terms of like these representations, right? So I think you really understand it and you got it when you can represent it well and you can interpret that representation and output it well, right? And so now that's when you really kind of understand what's going on. So this is why in some ways, when you're forced to teach something is when you really learn it.
Good point. Yeah.
Right? Because then you have to represent it and you have to be able to get it out well so that you can convey it well to someone else, right? And so a lot of times we think we know it until we have to explain it, and then we realize we don't know it, right? So, but that's just about representation, and how.
And there's a third level of trying to understand whether or not they actually got it. You may think that they understood it. They may think they understood it, but it's totally different understanding than what you got. But yeah. Sorry. Anyway, great talk. Thank you for joining us for the Neuroscience Cafe tonight. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a question about mental rotation.
Oh, just the issue of, how do you sort of imagine something looks from someone else's perspective? I mean, that's the general mental rotation task. Adrian, don't you have a faculty member who studies that? And isn't it the case that at least in some cases, patients with schizophrenia are actually better at this than people without schizophrenia? The idea they're not as locked into their own perspective and they can sort of jump around better.
I'm not sure who you speak about.
Was that Young-Hee Lee? Didn't she talk about that?
Young-Hee?
Yeah, Young-Hee.
Okay, that's possible. Yeah. But
people have certainly studied mental rotation, and the idea, it's one thing to perceive it. How can you imagine it being twisted, or how can you imagine it looking from someone else's viewpoint? There's a vast literature on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will ask her, but Okay, well, we had really a lot of very good questions. It was very interesting. Are there other questions? Well,
May I ask?
if there are no more questions, we're going to thank you very much, Dr. Newman. That it was really a very, very interesting talk, and I think it shows that the audience was really into it. And thank you everybody for coming, and make sure you are coming next time so that we can build. Oh, someone is asking for a question. Yeah, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Hey, Dr. Newman. I know you were talking about architecture's design, like their point of view is different than yours and mine. But I know also at the same time you said you can train your spiritual perspective from block games. Does that same method helps on like older adults, like age over 40 or 50, to like expand their creativity at the same time? Or that only works on children?
No, I would say yes. And so and thinking about like as we age, I just think it's always important to try to push yourself and learn something completely different and new. And so no, I think you can definitely train on these kinds of things as well. I mean, and I don't know if there's studies that show learning in patients, well, in older adults. I don't know about patients with dementia, but I mean, I would argue that you should try to do some of that with dementia patients as well.
I just want to ask because I know there are some people born with a good, like insane creativity, just, you know, their brain somehow has a better spiritual perspective than others. And some people might not, like, for example, like person like me, I cannot be creative. I was a little creative when, you know, when you're younger, you think less than what the reality
You're
is.
a scientist, right? So you're creative. You're just creative in a different way.
Okay.
I mean, I would never say that a scientist isn't creative, right? Because you're creative.
True.
Right? Maybe not art, like, you know, artistic as art is defined, creative.
True.
But yeah. So do you mean like you're not like a visual artist? You can't draw or something like that?
It's a big question because I'm a pianist, and sometimes me and my like friends that in the music world, most of them are so creative. You know, you give them a thing like a rhythm, they can make it so interesting. Such a like maybe like one rhythm they can make it like 10, but for me I can only make it 1. I don't know. It's the same as in arts, like drawing. I mean, I'm good at copying stuff, but I'm not good at, you know, being creative.
Yeah. So now we don't understand like these types of individual differences.
Right.
But I'll give you like just a story about my daughter, right? Because she's also a musician. Well, she played piano and trombone. And she was in jazz band with trombone. But her personality is such that she just would not allow herself to improvise. Right? She needed to control it. and she couldn't let go. And so that's more personality and just not sort of allowing yourself to kind of just sort of get out of your head and just kind of let go. And so some of this is like, and sort of separating the personality part from, you know, skill. I mean, those are different things. And so we all have our strengths and weaknesses. And it may be why science is sort of more controlled for you. You can handle it. And if you just kind of like get out of your head, then you can probably maybe do the same thing. Some of them get close to where your friends are, right? And so if you just maybe sort of play around and take a look at like your personality versus their personality and see if there's some differences there. Because I promise you, she just would, I mean, like she would break down when it was time to improvise because it was like, she couldn't let go. she could not let go. I'm like, it's okay, you're at home, nobody's here. She could not. And I think the other thing about this is like really kind of off topic and we're probably over time, but the other thing is that we think about cognition being only in our brains, right? But there's also embodiment too. And some of that kind of letting go is just letting your body kind of go and do what it does. Like so we've done some like this experiment with the Tower of London task, which is like a visual-spatial problem-solving task. But once you get really good at that, because there were just some tricks, what you end up doing is you're not really problem-solving anymore. Your fingers will just go. I'm like, you just like the motor cortex just sees a problem and you just kind of go and you're not thinking anymore. But you have to, like let your prefrontal cortex kind of stop and go. And some people just can't do that.
Right. For the thing about music is for like reading sheet music, that's more like a visual perspective. I'm really good at that. You know, if you just read like one page, I remember everything that's on the page. But the same thing like you said about spiritual perspective, it sometimes it almost feels like it's very hard, almost impossibly to do. And you know, like you said, you can get it trained up if you take like drawing classes, but
no, not that. Because even if you took a drawing class, you'd probably still stay in the lines. You'll probably still stay in the lines and not sort of be creative and do like, you know, something more abstract. Be like a
Thank you,
director.
Doctor.
So, okay.
Okay. Well, I think we can at this time say goodbye to everybody. Again, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you very much, Dr. Newman, for this really nice talk. We'll see you next month. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.